What's up, hobby friends? My name is Casey and this is eBay Miniature Rescues. Today, we're going to take a look at what is possibly the worst set of minis I've ever had the pleasure of working on. So there I was browsing eBay for army deals, and I happened to come across a rather peculiar auction. There was one picture, and not a very good one, but there were a ton of minis. The description was pretty vague as well. 84 Blades of Khorne models, mostly made up of bloodletters. These are the kind of auctions you just don't see every day. I had a low bid on it just to save it, but I came back for the last few minutes to see what would happen. A few bids came in last minute, but I ended up claiming this auction for 85 bucks. A massive deal for this army. The only real issue, what did it actually look like and how much work was needed to get it to a playable level? Well, let's find out. So here's the army as it sits. It's in pretty rough shape. A little worse than I anticipated from the actual photo, but this is totally a salvageable army, and I intend to fix and paint all of these models. Since that is a massive undertaking, it kind of goes without saying that this task won't be accomplished today. So I highly recommend that you subscribe so you won't miss any of the intense work I'm about to undertake. Today, specifically, I'm going to focus on a model that will end up going into this army, and then back up on eBay when it's all said and done. The always amazing BloodThirster. Let's take a look at this guy and start going through the rescue process. Okay, so there are a few issues with this model. Each piece has been previously pinned, and while that can be a good thing, that also means that drilling a new hole will be rather difficult. But we'll try and do the best with what we have on that one. Another issue is that the whip handle is missing pieces. It looks like there was some green stuff work done to kind of cover that up, but I'm going to remove all that and start fresh. The only real major issue is the noticeably missing wings. I was thinking of trying to find some original wings, but they do go for quite a bit of money on their own, when buying on eBay. So I opted to 3D print some wings that would still look really good with the model, and I figured while I was at it, I would cook up a base for him as well. Before we get to that though, we need to strip the paint off this model and put him together. I started by tossing the pieces into a sonic cleaner filled with 70% isopropyl alcohol. Here's a quick time lapse of one cycle. You can see the paint start to break down, and after even a few minutes, I come in with a toothbrush and it takes that paint all the way down to metal. After the paint is stripped, I printed out those extra parts and brought everything over to the table. Here's where the real work begins. I'm going to start by fixing up the whip handle by adding a new top piece, kind of a hilt. Since all these blood letters were just sitting here, I decided to grab a head and make it the hilt of the whip. There are two notches on top of that hilt, where I assume another pewter piece is supposed to go. So I drilled out corresponding holes in the head to make it fit more or less flush with that handle. Once that fit looked pretty good, I lined up the whip over the top of the head so I could drill out a seat for it so it would sit in there nicely. After the main holes were drilled, I went in with paperclip sized bit and put the hole into each piece of pewter. That way the paperclip would go through the entire piece and really give it some stability. Once the pieces were fit together, I super glued everything into place. I then proceeded to do the same thing with the wings, a couple of holes and some paper clips, and these things won't be going anywhere. So that was pretty much phase 1, and we have a model that at least is not in pieces anymore. Now we have to move on to phase 2, which is gap filling and kind of finishing the model off. Besides paint. Using Milliput, I'm going to fill in any of the gaps in our restoration job, trying to make it as smooth as I can. Milliput is really great because it has a relatively long working time, can be smoothed with water, and it dries in about 4 hours. So adding Milliput into all of these problem areas covers up the large gaps and brings the pieces together and allows us to at least get the model primed in an afternoon. While that Milliput is drying, I'm going to attach the model to our printed base. I move him around to find a good angle. This model sits a little weird, so I wanted to make sure that he was leaning back just a little bit so you can really see his face. Once I found the spot that I liked, I dabbed a bit of paint onto the ends of the pins that were attached to his feet. Then I placed that on the base so the paint would then transfer. From there, it was as easy as just drilling out the marked areas and gluing him down to the base. It's also a good idea for pretty large models like this to use some super glue activator. That way you fix the model onto whatever it is pretty quickly. Resin bases can be kind of dull. There's something about them that just screams out how fake the world is that our models are supposed to be living in. I like to throw a little bit of realism into the mix by gluing down some actual sand. This kind of hides the fact that the base is just a chunk of plastic and makes the scene a little more realistic. Once the sand is dry, it's time to lock in the model and really see what it's going to look like. This part of the process is one of the most satisfying. Taking the model from parts and pieces and finally making it into one cohesive piece. The primer brings it all together and removes the doubt that this thing isn't the way it was intended to be. Now it looks unified and feels like an actual model. It's just so satisfying. Now that the model is built and it's looking pretty good, we can start to add some color. Here are the colors I'm using for this project. Pretty basic, but I want this model to see a ton of games. So I'm shooting for a tabletop standard model with the intention of being handled quite frequently. I mean, I like a more display looking model as much as everyone else, but when you want to build and paint a pretty big army, you need to have realistic expectations as to what it takes in order to actually complete that project. This model will look pretty good, but it doesn't have to look over the top great in order to take out a squad of, say, Lumineth Realm Lords on turn 1. Starting with a dark red, I'm going to go over a majority of the model. I want the shadows to be darker, so I'm mostly concentrating this at a 45-degree angle around the model. Red covers fairly well through an airbrush, but the natural transparency of the color does make it easier to control where the light is coming from. Next up, a slightly brighter red. This will basically be a layer over the last one, but only being shot from above. That way our dark red shadows are preserved and we get a nice highlight from above. I mostly emptied the pot of my airbrush of that red and added in some bright orange. What's left of the red in the pot will marry with the orange and give us a really nice vibrant highlight. I'm being pretty selective with this one, really trying to hit the highest points and make some of those details really stand out. Once the airbrushing step is done, I'm going to grab my wet palette and start filling in the rest of the details. I put the same reds and orange that I used in the airbrush and mixed a gradient from the darkest to the brightest. That way we have all of our airbrush colors on hand. I also added in some black, browns, purple, and whites in order to mix up things that we might need for later. I will be starting with black and taking care of all of the hair on this beast. Then I'll move on to a lightish tan for all of the bones. In order to bring in some life to the face and more prominent features, I use that airbrush gradient to give highlights on the face. Luckily, there is some nice raised detail to follow on the face, so I worked my way up from red all the way up to orange with a little bit of white in it. I think this really brings out the face and keeps your eye in the middle of the model, which is pretty much exactly what you want for a gaming piece. There's just enough of something to look at on the table, and you see that detail, and it still stands out from pretty far away, but you didn't have to do everything. Next up, I'm going to fill in the metallics. I'll start with a dark silver and work my way up to a very bright aluminum on the highest points. I also mixed Vallejo metal color gold and copper together to get a kind of dirty gold to fill in the trim. Once these parts are all highlighted with a bright silver, it brings them all together and makes for a very nice metal suit of armor. One of the last things we really need to do is work on that base a little bit more. So I dry brushed the whole thing with a light gray to really bring out that rock and stone. Some of the sand came off, leaving a little bit of that resin showing. I obviously didn't wait long enough for the primer to dry before really getting in there. That's okay though, because I've got an idea on how to cover that up without really having to redo any of the base. Of course, it's just as easy to brush on some of that primer and let that actually dry and come back with that paint. But we got some other stuff in mind. Before that though, let's take care of this sweet little altar on the back of the base. I decided to paint the book with a bit of skin color, followed that up by some purple brown glazes to age it down a little bit, and then I came in with some red and drew some symbols in and some lines that kinda, fill out that book onto the pages. I love little storytelling bits like this on bases. It gives the model just that little extra and makes your gaming pieces really stand out on the tabletop. I also filled in the carvings on the table next to the book for a little bit of added creepiness. And in order to fix those problem areas on the base, I decided to lay down some brown and black pigment powders. This covers up any weird areas and adds a bit more realism to the base. And in all honesty, this is probably a pretty similar route that I'm going to take for the whole army. I think it plays well with the red skin and the red fire theme. Spraying everything down with a varnish locks in our pieces and gets everything ready for a game. This rescue was a particularly fun one. We got a solid jumpstart into this Blades of Khorne army and knocked out one of the cooler models for the army. There's still a ton of work to do, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the fun. Ooh, I should also mention, I found another one of these models in a similar condition for pretty much next to nothing while filming this video. So now there's going to be 2 of these in this army. This army will be going back up on eBay when it's all done. So it'll be interesting to see how far we can take this thing without spending really any extra money. I, for one, can't wait to see how it goes, and I truly hope you are as excited as I am. Until next time, please enjoy this freshly resurrected BloodThirster. Thank you once again for joining me on another miniature rescue. If you liked something about this video, please like, share, and subscribe as it really helps out the channel. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video.